Hemostasis is the fancy scientific technical name for the blood clotting process. The functions of blood clotting are to stop blood loss. Matters not how large the cut is, the injury to blood vessels, but the reactions are going to be the same. Of course, the magnitude of the injury is going to determine just how fast the platelets and tissue factors can react and stop blood loss. Hemostasis is also establishing a framework for tissue repair. You'll see as we go through the process that part of the function of a platelet is to pull the edges of damaged tissue back together. That's going to speed up the amount of time, or let's say it this way, that's going to reduce the amount of time needed for tissue repair. Clot retraction is what we're talking about as far as pulling the edges together and reducing that size. Finally, fibrinolysis. Once the tissue is at a stage where the clot is no longer needed, then we need the means to dissolve that clot. There are three phases of hemostasis. The vascular phase, which occurs in blood vessels, the platelet phase, which involves the platelets, coagulation phase, where the actual clot is formed. As you can see, they're fairly aptly named, logically named. To begin with, the vascular phase. This starts with a vascular spasm, which begins immediately when the blood vessel is damaged. It's almost like it's a reflex action where the smooth muscle cells that are in those vessels retract and pull together. It lasts for about 30 minutes after an injury, with those endothelial cells contracting. At the same time, the endothelial cells are releasing endothelins, which cause the cells to become sticky. When they are sticky, they will adhere to platelets as well as to each other. If they stick together, there's a good chance that we can reduce the amount of blood loss again. Now, while I'm talking about each of these phases individually and making it sound like first we get vascular spasm, then we get platelet action, and so on, in reality, these are all happening at the same time. The platelet phase begins when the sticky endothelial cells can attract the platelets and make them stay there. They're going to form an aggregate, a mass of platelets. And once these platelets start accumulating there, they get activated. And when they are activated, they release a variety of chemicals that promote further aggregation, promote vascular spasm, and finally clotting and then vessel repair. Now, an interesting factor here is that one of the chemicals, and I don't expect you to remember this chemical, but one of the chemicals that's produced by the platelets, it's called thromboxane A2, is adversely affected by consuming aspirin. Aspirin interferes with it, and that is why aspirin prolongs the clotting process and why you see a larger amount of bleeding, bruising as a result of an injury. Coagulation phase begins once we have two of the chemicals that are needed, and then following the accumulation of those chemicals, we have a cascade of chemical reactions. The extrinsic pathway begins with tissue factor, which comes from damaged tissue cells. Extrinsic pathway begins outside of blood components. Extrinsic meaning outside. Once we get that tissue factor, then we have a cascade of events. And I want you to notice too that calcium is a very large factor in blood clotting. If you don't have enough calcium, then clotting process is going to be slowed down again. Once we have factor 10, the extrinsic pathway has been completed. Now, that doesn't mean it's over, done with, or anything. The reactions are going to continue, but factor 10 allows us to enter a new pathway. The intrinsic pathway begins with factors from the blood. In other words, from the platelet. We're looking for platelet factor here, and once again, once we have that, then we can go through the cascade of reactions and end with factor 10, just like we did in the extrinsic pathway. Once we have that factor 10, we move into the common pathway. In the common pathway, we have some very important things happening. Factor 10 will react with prothrombin activator, which converts prothrombin, which normally exists in the plasma, to thrombin. And once thrombin is converted, then it will work with fibrinogen, and if you recall, that is one of the important plasma proteins. The fibrinogen is converted to fibrin, which is a filamentous protein. Take a look at the photomicrograph in the lower right-hand corner. Notice all of the fibers running across there. That's the fibrin. Notice also that you have red blood cells in there and we have platelets in there. So our blood clot is made up of fibrin, red blood cells, and platelets. Once we get our clot, the interest in the tissue repair is to bring the edges of the damaged tissues closer together. Basically what happens here is that the platelets contract, and that pulls the edges together, pulls the clot inward and smaller. This is going to occur over about a 30 to 60 minute time period. After the clot has formed and healing has begun, we have no use for the clot any longer. So fibrinolysis can now begin. Fibrin, remember, is the filamentous protein. Lysis means to break apart. So we're going to break apart the fibrin of the blood clot. Plasminogen is a proenzyme that is activated by thrombin, as well as tissue plasminogen activator, which comes from damaged tissues. When we get those three together and activate that proenzyme, then that's going to produce plasmin, and the plasmin itself actually breaks down the fibrin fibers.